CEO humiliated her before 400 employees. 14 hours later, the auditor halted the SOX audit. "Stand up," the CEO said, his voice slicing through the packed auditorium. "Stand up and admit this audit failed because of you." 400 employees turned in perfect silence as every eye settled on one woman. She rose without defending herself, without a single excuse. By sunrise, the external auditor would uncover one overlooked detail tied to SOX Section 404 that would bring the entire audit to a halt and make that humiliating moment impossible to forget. The applause hadn't even faded when the silence became heavier than the accusation. Under the blinding white lights, the CEO stood confidently at the center of the stage, while nearly 400 employees watched from the auditorium. Behind him, two enormous screens displayed the company's annual theme in elegant blue letters: "Integrity through accountability." The words looked almost theatrical now. "Stand up," the CEO said, his voice calm enough to make every syllable sting. "Stand up and admit this audit failed because of you." Every chair stopped moving. Every whispered conversation disappeared. Emily slowly rose to her feet. She didn't defend herself. She didn't interrupt. She didn't remind anyone that she had spent the previous 6 weeks chasing missing documentation, rescheduling ignored meetings, and sending unanswered emails to department heads who suddenly acted as though compliance was someone else's problem. She simply stood there with her hands folded, allowing the room to believe whatever story it wanted. Sometimes silence is confused with surrender. Sometimes it's simply the decision to let the truth arrive on its own. The CEO nodded with visible satisfaction. "This," he announced, turning toward the audience with the confidence of someone certain he had just delivered a leadership lesson, "is what accountability looks like." A wave of restrained applause rolled across the auditorium. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The damage had already been done. Emily noticed colleagues lowering their eyes, not because they believed she was guilty, but because looking at her meant admitting they knew more than they were willing to say. The finance director suddenly became fascinated by his notes. Someone from legal adjusted her glasses without looking up. Two managers who had personally thanked Emily for saving previous audits stared straight ahead as though they had never spoken to her before. Corporate loyalty often evaporates the moment it becomes expensive. In that room, reputation was changing hands faster than any spreadsheet on the company's servers. As executives continued presenting colorful charts and optimistic projections, Emily's phone vibrated once beneath the conference table. She glanced down for only a second. One new email, no subject line she recognized. The sender was an administrative coordinator from the external auditor's office. That was unusual. Communication during an active SOX Section 404 review almost never bypassed scheduled channels unless something required immediate clarification. She resisted every instinct telling her to open it. The CEO was still speaking, smiling for the cameras positioned around the auditorium, confidently describing the company's commitment to transparency. The contrast almost made her laugh. Somewhere inside the building, a tiny detail had just shifted. She couldn't explain why, but the feeling settled in her stomach like the first distant rumble before a storm. When the town hall finally ended, employees spilled into the polished glass corridors in carefully organized groups. Conversations started quietly, then grew louder as people convinced themselves they had witnessed simple accountability instead of a public humiliation. Emily walked alone. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked if she was all right. The elevators reflected the soft morning light pouring through the lobby windows, making the entire headquarters feel strangely cold despite its expensive design. As soon as the doors closed behind her, she finally opened the email. It wasn't long, only 2 sentences. The external auditor requested confirmation of the company's authorized SOX Section 404 communication contact before continuing the next phase of testing. Attached was a copy of the current authorization list. Emily stared at the attachment without opening it. She already knew what should have been inside. What she didn't know was whether anyone else had bothered to verify it recently. That single thought refused to leave her mind. She reached her office, closed the door, and slowly opened the attachment. The familiar corporate letterhead appeared first, followed by pages of authorization records, signatures, approval dates, and regulatory references. Her eyes moved automatically across the document until they froze on one line. She blinked once, then leaned closer to the monitor. There it was. Effective date? Executive approval. Audit Governance Committee signature. Authorized primary contact for SOX Section 404, External Audit Communications. Emily Carter. No deputy, no alternate, no executive override. Just one officially designated individual recognized by both the company and the auditing firm. She remembered preparing the paperwork nearly a year earlier, after legal insisted communication had to remain centralized for regulatory consistency. The CEO had signed it himself. She remembered handing him the folder. She even remembered the joke he made about too much paperwork. Apparently, everyone else had forgotten. A second email appeared before she could process the first. This one came directly from the external auditor. The wording was polite, professional, and remarkably simple. They had attempted to obtain documentation through executive leadership earlier that morning, but had encountered conflicting instructions. Before proceeding, they requested confirmation from the company's officially authorized contact. Emily looked through the glass wall of her office toward the executive floor, where assistants hurried between conference rooms carrying binders and laptops. Nobody had called her. Nobody had informed her that the audit team had already arrived. The same executives who had blamed her in front of 400 employees were now trying to conduct portions of the SOX Section 404 review without the one person their own governance documents legally identified as the required point of contact. For the first time that day, Emily allowed herself a slow, quiet smile. Not because anyone was about to lose, but because facts have a strange habit of arriving exactly when emotions run out of arguments. And that wasn't even the detail that would make everything inside headquarters suddenly stop. If you think you've already figured out what really happened, you're missing the one detail that changes the entire story. Emily didn't rush to answer the email. She read it 3 times instead, noticing what most people would have overlooked. The external auditor wasn't asking for missing files or explanations. They were asking for authorization. That single word carried far more weight than the executives upstairs realized. In large public companies, especially during a SOX Section 404 audit, process matters just as much as evidence. If information flows through the wrong person, every conclusion can be challenged. Emily knew that because she had written the communication protocol herself nearly a year earlier. Ironically, the very policy everyone had forgotten was now sitting quietly inside the auditor's inbox, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. She leaned back, took one slow breath, and forwarded the signed authorization letter exactly as requested, without commentary, without emotion, without trying to prove anyone wrong. Facts never need raised voices. Meanwhile, the executive conference room looked nothing like the polished image presented during the morning town hall. Coffee cups covered the table, laptops were open in every direction, and department heads were speaking over one another as new requests from the audit team kept arriving. The CEO paced between the windows and the screen displaying the audit timeline. "Why are they asking the same questions again?" he snapped. "We already gave them everything they need." The chief financial officer shook his head. "Apparently not." Someone suggested calling legal, someone else blamed finance. Another manager quietly implied Emily hadn't prepared the audit properly before disappearing into the hallway to avoid further discussion. Nobody realized that the problem wasn't the documents, it was the chain of authority. The room was solving the wrong puzzle while believing they were only one step from success. At exactly 8:17 that evening, the lead external auditor received Emily's reply. It contained the signed governance authorization, the original board-approved communication matrix, and a short, professional confirmation that she remained available for any requests relating to SOX Section 404 compliance. Nothing more. No complaint, no reference to the public accusation, no mention of the CEO. Less than 5 minutes later, the auditor compared the authorization against the communication log generated throughout the day. The names didn't match. Every significant request had been redirected through executives who were never formally authorized to represent the company during the audit. The discrepancy wasn't dramatic on paper, but to an experienced auditor, it was impossible to ignore. A tiny procedural crack had suddenly widened into a question about the integrity of the entire review. The atmosphere inside headquarters shifted almost instantly, although nobody yet understood why. Phones started ringing between departments that normally communicated only by email. Legal requested copies of governance records. Internal audit searched archived approval documents. Executive assistants hurried through the corridors carrying thick binders that nobody had opened for months. Even the building itself seemed different after sunset. The polished glass walls reflected empty workstations while lights remained on across nearly every floor. It felt less like an office and more like a ship sailing into fog without realizing the lighthouse had disappeared behind it. Emily stayed in her office, answering every question the auditors sent with calm precision. She wasn't trying to expose anyone. She was simply doing the job she had always done. The irony was almost painful. The person publicly blamed for the failed audit had become the only person capable of keeping it legally valid. Shortly after midnight, another message arrived, this time marked urgent. The lead external auditor requested an immediate video call. Emily joined from the same quiet conference room where she had spent countless evenings preparing compliance reports. On the other side of the screen sat 3 auditors, their expressions professional but noticeably more serious than before. One of them held the authorization document beside the audit communication log. "Can you confirm," he asked, "that no changes have been made to this governance designation since its approval?" Emily answered honestly, "None." Another pause followed. The auditors exchanged quick glances before thanking her and ending the meeting without another question. The entire conversation had lasted less than 4 minutes. Yet when the screen went dark, Emily understood that something significant had just happened. Auditors rarely end conversations that quickly, unless they've already found what they were looking for. 14 hours after the CEO had ordered her to stand before 400 employees and accept responsibility, the lead external auditor walked into the executive conference room carrying a single folder. The room fell silent before he even spoke. He placed the authorization document on the table, looked around at every executive present, and said evenly, "We're suspending the audit until the company's governance structure and authorized communication process are formally reconciled." Nobody answered. The CEO reached for the folder, read the highlighted line identifying Emily as the sole authorized SOX Section 404 contact, and the confidence that had filled the auditorium that morning quietly disappeared. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just the unmistakable sound of certainty collapsing under the weight of documented facts. In the end, no speech, title, or public accusation mattered as much as one forgotten signature on one officially approved document. Have you ever watched a workplace turn against the wrong person? Tell me your experience in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The conference room remained silent long after the external auditor left. Nobody reached for the coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. Nobody touched the presentation slides still glowing on the wall. For the first time that day, every executive understood they were no longer discussing an employee's performance. They were discussing a breakdown in corporate governance. The CEO slowly lowered the authorization document onto the table, reading Emily's name again as if it might somehow change the second time. It didn't. The signature at the bottom was his own. Legal was the first to speak. "We need to determine whether this designation was ever formally amended." "It wasn't," answered the compliance director quietly. "Then why wasn't she involved today?" No one responded. The question drifted across the room like smoke, settling on every person who had chosen convenience over procedure. One executive cleared his throat before suggesting there had been a misunderstanding. Another insisted the communication chain had been handled internally. The explanation sounded reasonable for exactly 3 seconds, until the company's general counsel opened the governance manual and pointed to the highlighted section. The language couldn't have been clearer. During the SOX Section 404 review, all official communication with the external auditor had to pass through the designated authorized contact unless a new authorization had been formally approved. No amendment existed. Every shortcut taken throughout the day suddenly became part of the record. Across the building, Emily was organizing documents with the same calm rhythm she had followed for years. She wasn't celebrating. There was nothing satisfying about watching a preventable mistake grow into a corporate crisis. The office had become unusually quiet after midnight. Cleaning crews moved through empty hallways with rolling carts, their conversations barely audible against the hum of fluorescent lights. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city shimmered beneath a light rain, each reflection stretching across the glass like watercolor. Her inbox continued filling with requests from the audit team, and she answered every one with precise documentation, timestamps, and approved records. Each response was factual, concise, and impossible to dispute. Then her phone rang. It was the chief legal officer, not an assistant, not a coordinator, the chief legal officer himself. "Emily," he said after a brief pause, "I need to ask you a very specific question. Has anyone instructed you, verbally or in writing, to step down as the company's authorized SOX Section 404 contact?" She looked toward the authorization letter still open on her monitor. "No." "And have you signed any delegation of authority?" "No." Another silence followed, longer this time. "Thank you," he replied. "That's all I needed." The call ended. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet Emily felt the atmosphere change. Questions inside the executive floor were no longer about missing documents. They had become questions about responsibility, governance, and decision-making. Those were far more dangerous because they left permanent paper trails. An hour later, a calendar invitation appeared on her screen. Mandatory executive review. Attendance required. 8 a.m. No agenda, no explanation. Just a list of names that included the CEO, the CFO, the general counsel, internal audit, and Emily. For the first time since the public accusation, her name appeared beside theirs, not below them. She closed her laptop and looked around the empty office. Earlier that morning, she had walked through these same corridors carrying the weight of public blame. Now the building felt different. The polished floors, the quiet elevators, even the conference rooms seemed stripped of their confidence. Corporate authority often appears immovable, until one verified document reminds everyone that titles don't rewrite procedures. As Emily switched off the lights in her office, she had no idea what would happen at the morning meeting. But one thing was already undeniable. The story inside the company had changed, not because someone argued louder, because the facts finally had the floor. The executive conference room felt completely different at 8 o'clock the next morning. Yesterday it had been filled with certainty, polished speeches, and confident decisions. Today, it felt like a courtroom without a judge. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass walls, bathed in the pale light of dawn, while untouched coffee cups lined the table like forgotten props from a play that had ended badly. Nobody spoke as Emily walked in. Several executives looked up, then quickly looked away. The CEO remained standing near the window, arms crossed, staring at the parking lot below as though answers might appear between the rows of cars. For the first time in years, silence belonged to him instead of everyone else. The general counsel broke it. "Before we discuss the audit, we need to establish the facts." His voice was calm, almost detached. A thick binder landed on the table with a muted thud. Inside were governance approvals, board resolutions, compliance procedures, communication logs, and every document connected to the company's SOX Section 404 process. Page after page confirmed the same uncomfortable truth. Emily had never been removed as the authorized contact. No replacement had ever been approved. No emergency delegation existed. Every communication that bypassed her had violated the company's own governance procedures. Nobody argued. They couldn't. Every signature belonged to someone sitting in that very room. The CEO finally turned around. He looked older than he had 24 hours earlier. Not physically, but the confidence that usually surrounded him had faded. "Why didn't anyone catch this?" he asked quietly. It wasn't directed at Emily. It wasn't directed at legal. It seemed directed at the room itself. Department heads exchanged uncertain glances. Someone admitted they had assumed the authorization had been updated months ago. Another confessed they never checked because everyone believed executive approval was enough. Internal audit simply wrote notes without saying a word. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. An organization that prided itself on process had failed because everyone trusted assumptions more than documentation. Emily was finally asked to speak, not to defend herself, not to explain the public accusation, only to answer technical questions. She explained how the authorization process had been created, why regulators preferred a single point of contact, how changes required board approval, and why consistency protected both the company and the integrity of the audit. Her tone never changed. She didn't mention the humiliation from the previous morning. She didn't remind anyone what had happened in front of 400 employees. The room noticed anyway. The contrast between her professionalism and yesterday's public blame was impossible to miss. Sometimes dignity becomes louder after it survives silence. Halfway through the meeting, the conference room doors opened. The lead external auditor stepped inside carrying another folder. Every conversation stopped immediately. He thanked everyone for gathering and placed several updated documents on the table. After reviewing the governance records and the communication history, he said, "We've concluded that the issue is procedural rather than evidentiary. At this time, we are not questioning the integrity of the financial controls themselves. We are requiring corrective governance actions before the audit resumes." The tension in the room eased, but only slightly. The audit hadn't failed. The process had. That distinction changed everything. No headlines, no regulatory disaster, no catastrophic findings. Instead, there would be formal remediation, revised governance controls, documented training, and a corrected communication structure. Expensive? Yes. Embarrassing? Absolutely. But survivable. Several executives quietly exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. The CEO remained expressionless, knowing that the largest cost wasn't financial, it was credibility. As the meeting came to an end, he looked directly at Emily. There was another long silence. Then, in a voice far quieter than the one that had filled the auditorium the previous day, he spoke. I owe you an apology." No speech followed, no attempt to justify his decision, no carefully crafted explanation, just 7 simple words that everyone in the room knew had arrived far too late. Emily nodded politely. "Thank you. Nothing more." She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't ask for compensation. She didn't ask anyone to repeat the apology in front of 400 employees. She simply gathered her binder, wished everyone a productive day, and walked toward the door. As it closed behind her, the room remained silent once again. But this silence was different. Yesterday it had protected power. Today it respected the truth. The weeks that followed transformed the company in ways no motivational speech ever could. The audit resumed under the corrected governance process, this time with every communication flowing through the proper SOX Section 404 channel. Procedures that had existed only as forgotten documents inside binders suddenly became mandatory reading. Managers who once dismissed compliance meetings now arrived early with notebooks open. The phrase, "We'll figure it out later," quietly disappeared from conference rooms, replaced by a far less glamorous question. What does the policy actually say? It wasn't exciting, it wasn't dramatic, but it was exactly how lasting change usually begins. Emily returned to her routine as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She still arrived before sunrise, still carried the same worn leather notebook, still preferred emails with complete documentation over hurried phone calls. People began stopping by her office, not because of her title, but because they trusted her judgment. New employees asked for advice. Department heads requested her opinion before making compliance decisions. Even executives who had barely acknowledged her existence started listening when she spoke. Respect hadn't been restored through sympathy. It had been earned through consistency, the one quality that had never abandoned her, even when everyone else had. One afternoon, while organizing archived audit files, Emily found a printed copy of the authorization letter that had changed everything. The paper itself looked ordinary. Black ink, corporate logo, a few signatures. Nothing about it suggested it had once brought an entire executive team to a standstill. She smiled quietly before placing it back into the archive. The document had never possessed any real power on its own. Its power came from something much simpler. It represented the truth. And the truth doesn't become stronger because people believe it. It remains strong even when they don't. Several months later, the company's board held its annual leadership meeting. This time, there were no dramatic presentations about accountability. Instead, the agenda included a new governance framework, revised audit procedures, and one additional policy that every executive unanimously approved. No employee could ever again become the public face of a failure before a formal review of the documented facts. The rule was short, almost understated, but everyone in the room understood why it existed. Some lessons are too expensive to learn twice. The CEO never spoke publicly about that morning in front of 400 employees. He didn't need to. His leadership style changed in quieter ways. Meetings became shorter and more deliberate. Questions replaced assumptions. He asked for evidence before conclusions. When mistakes happened, he insisted on understanding the process before identifying responsibility. Those who worked closely with him noticed the difference. Those who didn't simply assumed he had become a more thoughtful executive. Few people knew the exact moment that transformation had begun. As for Emily, she never viewed the experience as a victory over another person. She viewed it as a reminder that integrity isn't tested when everyone agrees with you. It's tested when speaking would be easier than waiting, and when waiting requires more courage than anyone else can see. She had stood in silence while others rushed to judgment. She had answered every question with facts instead of emotion. And when the truth finally arrived, it didn't need applause, revenge, or celebration. Because in the end, the most powerful person in the room wasn't the one standing on the stage with a microphone. It was the one quietly holding the document everyone else had forgotten.